it. There we go. So I would now like to introduce Dave Knight, who's going to cover today's topic, tackling Scope 3 emissions. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Sabrina. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today. Yeah, a tough ask. So yeah, basically, just to sort of in terms of today, as I say, I will be asking, breaking for questions throughout, so please feel free to ask questions at that point. If you do have anything that you do want to raise, either wait until we get to the questions bit, or if you do want to ask the question at the time, just pop it in the chat just so it's there. I'm going to try and sort of break up from, within the actual content itself, but if something is really pressing, then by all means raise your hand, and then we'll discuss it as well. So tackling Scope 3 emissions. So we've done various sort of carbon counting workshops previously, and today we're going to look at Scope 3. Just very quickly as we go through the slides, just making sure everyone can see everything. So yeah, my name is David Knight. I am Principal Consultant for Investors in the Environment. Hello. Hello. So yeah, Principal Consultant for IIE. My main focus within my role at IIE is around energy and carbon. So often I speak to organizations to understand sort of carbon footprinting and aspects they need, certainly looking at the net zero agenda and the sort of the future that holds for us as organizations. And really, we're looking today to sort of talk about one of the more complicated issues around sort of carbon footprinting and net zero, looking at Scope 3 emissions and what that actually means, how to look at that, what to include within that as well. So just in terms of today, these are sort of the core headings that we're going to focus on. But what I would like to say is that hopefully, so the idea is Scope 3, and this is sort of the problem I have with these sort of formats, is all of you as different organizations all have different pressures, have different requirements, and perhaps even different reporting needs. So to do something general like this and actually to cover everything is really complex and complicated. I don't think we actually have enough time within 2 hours. So really what I want to do today is to go through concepts and sort of introduce certain aspects to consider when we start to look at Scope 3 emissions. It's not going to be able to deal with each individual business. Realistically, that's something we should do on an individual level because you all have different needs. So this is just to hopefully give you a sort of a core overview of the different aspects around Scope 3 accounting, what to think about, what to consider. There are also different requirements for small organizations and larger organizations in terms of actually the exercise and the process you go through. A lot of the Scope 3 information out there is really set up against sort of larger ones with high impact, ones that need to actually spend a lot more time looking at their Scope 3 versus some of the smaller businesses where, while it's important to look at Scope 3, probably don't have the same level of responsibility, even the same impact as some of the larger ones. So it's trying to find a balance between the two is tricky. So we'll cover the concepts, and hopefully I'll try to sort of look at how we apply that across the organizations. But as always, as IE members, if anything we discuss in here today, there's something you actually think, I want to pick that up later on, you're always welcome to contact myself or to contact us as the team and say, yeah, we'd like to have a conversation to discuss this aspect further. And then obviously that's when we could do that one-to-one and actually work with you, as we move to forwards as well. But hopefully by the end of today, we'll have given you some understanding of some concepts, a couple of exercises to take away as well, and just a better understanding in terms of what your responsibility around Scope 3 is that you can then take into your organizations and to your green teams as well. So first of all, the net zero agenda. So I just wanted to cover this really to go over old ground because this sets the context for why we're actually looking at this and what we're doing. So Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. So this is where we first legally set the ambition to limit the warming of the planet to well below 2 degrees, aiming for a 1.5 degree pathway. So this is sort of the catalyst to everything that we're discussing today. It is actually the result of why the UK government was the first to set in law for the UK to achieve a net zero by 2050. That's been a big driver across the UK. It's certainly, not forced, but encouraged large organizations to really look at net zero, look at the understanding of net zero, look at what that means. And the key thing with net zero is it's valued across the value chain. So this is the importance. It's not just about me as an organization anymore. It's actually about me as an organization within my entire operational chain. So who am I buying off? Who am I selling to? And what does that actually look like? So it's now actually looking at operations across the entire body, not just me as an individual organization. That's one of the big changes and shifts that's occurred as a result of net zero being introduced. So simply put, achieving net zero is balancing the amount of emissions you generate with the amount of emissions that you remove, and that's the key part to be net zero. That's sort of the final, shall we say, nail in the coffin. Yes, reducing carbon emissions is fundamental and is absolutely the first place that we need to start. But to finalize and actually put the I's and the T's on that net zero is we have to remove the residual carbon from the atmosphere. So in order to become net zero, you need to first develop an understanding and measure of your total carbon emissions. That includes the emissions you have as an organization, but also where you have your influence, so your scope 3 or value chain. You need to reduce the level of emissions that are generated throughout your business activity across that value chain. You then need to remove or neutralize any remaining carbon emissions through either carbon removal or carbon capture systems or carbon sinks like natural infrastructure. And then also, under the Science Based Targets Initiative, to be truly net zero, we also need to start to consider beyond our scope 1 to 3 value chain and actually start to invest in climate mitigation. So that would also be investing in projects that actually help to support other places mitigate, reduce carbon emissions. So things like offsetting and that kind of stuff. So typically at net zero, it'd be good to actually, one, remove the carbon, but also invest in offsetting. So we do the two. So we prevent other carbon from being generated through funding projects while we remove the carbon that we're emitting so that we're net zero as well. And altogether, that's how we all become net zero. The key thing is as part of IE and as members, we're already doing quite a lot of this. You're already developing your understanding. You're already measuring your carbon footprints. You're already starting to have conversations to look at your scope 3 through waste or talking to suppliers or through procurement policies. And you're already working towards, reducing as much as possible. I think the only one that's left is really around, the mitigation part. The only thing that left is around the removals and this larger value chain. So that's obviously what we want to work with today and obviously going forwards with you as members as well. On the slide here, there is the net zero standards. This was produced by the Science Based Targets. It's the first net zero standard made available. It is aimed at 500 at the 500 companies, but it does have information that SMEs can pick up as well. Like anything else, it's a lot of information. Some of it will cover today, hopefully on a more simplified level, but certainly some of it will cover today. But yeah, there is that link there for anybody who wants to read up on that further if you think that's of value to you. So obviously we're talking about scope 3 and hopefully we're all aware of this, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what we refer to when we're talking about our scopes. So our emissions and how we generate emissions are broken down into 3 scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is essentially emissions as a result of any sources that we directly control or own as an organization, where we actually burn at source. So for example, your boilers, your fleet vehicles, machinery equipment that uses fuels, essentially anything that we essentially burn the fuel at source that we directly control or own falls part of our scope 1. Scope 2 is sort of a category amongst itself. It's anything related to the purchase of electricity, heat, or steam. So as organizations, we all use electricity, but we're not responsible for the generation. So we don't own the burning emission part, but we do have direct control over how we use the electricity. So that's why it's kind of separated into its own sort of band, because we have direct control over how we use electricity, what electricity we use, etc. And then everything else falls into scope 3. So basically scope 3 are emissions as a result of business activity where you do not have direct control over how that is being done. So as an example to that, waste. So we produce waste, a waste company comes and collects it. Now we're directly responsible for producing that waste, which is bringing that waste company to our organization, but we can't control the equipment they use. We can to some degree control how they get rid of it. So we can choose waste providers that use more for example, energy from waste rather than landfill, but ultimately we don't really have control over what kind of equipment they use or that as well. We're only responsible for producing the waste and therefore that indirect impact of carbon emissions as a result of that as well. So that's what we're focusing on today, is this scope 3 element. So when thinking about scope 3, the easy way to think about scope 3 is to think of it as a measure of the influence you have as an organization. And yes, smaller businesses and larger businesses, that range of influence will vary accordingly, but we all have a degree of influence. Even us as individuals, we have an area of influence. The choices that we make what do we buy? What do we purchase? What kind of materials that we purchase? That is a level of influence. If we choose to only buy of the organizations that have lower carbon, or we choose to buy materials that have a lower embodied carbon, our choice is actually influencing the market and influencing what organizations do. The communication you have as well. So how is it you communicate? What are you communicating? The way in which you talk and actually, address this and actually communicate that also has a level of influence as well. All of these have the potential to improve your carbon footprint for yourself and for other organizations. And by improving the carbon footprint for other organizations, it actually then improves your value chain. So the way I always look at it is that all individual businesses, your scope 1 and 2 emissions is another organization's scope 3 emissions. So by actually understanding and almost encouraging your suppliers to understand their direct carbon emissions, that helps you to understand your scope 3 emissions. So it's really an opportunity to actually think about, well, how do we work within our supply chain? How do we work with our partners? And how do we actually look to improve our overall standing? And that's sort of what we're going to cover today as well. But as I said, we all have different priorities. We all have different starting points. Some will be further along than others. Some may have already done a lot of what we've done today. Some may have never heard of these before, and so forth. It's all new to you. So one thing I'd always like to just say to you is that this is something that we do over time. It's a process. We're not asking you to do everything in one go. What we really want organizations to do, particularly SMEs, is to start with the sort of the simpler and the easier ones and then develop from that point. So we're talking concepts today. We're talking sort of activities and exercises that we can do, and we can do it to start with on a lighter level, and we can actually add and improve upon that as we either get used to how we do the exercises, or as the information becomes more available to us and our understanding of what we need becomes better for us as well. So really understanding your impact, so how much of a carbon impact your scope 3 has, and your level of influence is key. So one of the key learnings that I've taken away from a lot of the work that I've been doing within this is just particularly around SMEs. And I think sometimes SMEs, we kind of fall into this trap that we almost want to do more than we can, and we forget how much we've already done, and we're always pushing ourselves, what's next, and that's a great way to be. But I think sometimes we also have to recognize that sometimes we've actually done a lot, and that's good. We should celebrate and achieve and say, fantastic, we've done a lot, and not always take on more than we actually can do. So when we look at the pathway and we look at the information around sort of scope 3 and the accounting, so we look at the net zero standard, it actually talks about the responsibility of large organizations. And when it talks about SMEs, it always talks about that long-term development, because it does actually recognize and understand that as SMEs, we are time poor. We don't have the same structure as some of the large organizations. We don't have the same ability or influence as some of the large organizations. So actually recognizing that and using that to our advantage and say, well, look, we are doing everything we can, and we are going to take the step by step to ensure that we are, everything we do is the best that can be done, and that we're making the right choices at the right times to really make sure that we achieve the impact that we want to as well. So the first thing I just want to talk about when we're looking at scope 3 is essentially, this is the same as any other carbon accounting program. So for scope 1 and 2, how you account for your carbons is the same as what we would do for scope 3. The only real, other things, one of the biggest real changes is the data sets. So with scope 1 and 2, we have access and we have control of that data, or readily access to that data. For scope 3, we don't. So that's really the sort of caveat, is understanding what that data is, how to get to it. But what we actually include and what we need to do is the same process. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. They are essentially the global standard for methodology around carbon emission reporting. So they essentially have set the precedent in terms of how we account and how we report our carbon, and all of the UK reporting profiles, even ISO, etc. They all follow the same methodology. They have got a scope 3 accounting process. So it is there. It's a massive document. It's worth a read if you want to look at it, but it is quite a large document. There's a lot to take into it. And again, it is really complex because it is designed for those large organizations who may have slightly more complicated value chains than some of the small businesses. But within carbon accounting, what we want to do is we want to understand what it is that we need to include as part of our inventory. And that's what we're doing. We're building a carbon inventory. And so to do that, there's 5 principles that they've set out that we all should adhere to whenever we're looking at building our inventory. And this is the same across all of our carbon emissions, from scope 1 through to scope 3. So the principles, essentially, what we're talking about is relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. So in terms of relevance, the inventory we build, and what we mean by inventory is what are the different emission sources that we need to include, so that when we convert our data into carbon footprint, we're including everything we can to truly reflect what our carbon impact is. And so that's where the relevance comes in. Your inventory must contain information, both internal and external. So that's obviously scope 1 and scope 3, that people can use, that decision makers can use to inform decisions. So thinking about like your company characteristics, what your stakeholder needs, what's the structure of your organization, what's the business context and your relationship. So whatever we include as part of that inventory, you have to think about, well, any data that we have in it needs to be useful enough that whoever needs to make the decisions in terms of what we do, they have the right information to make those decisions. So that's the real fundamental core thing. It must be relevant. There's no point including something or excluding something if it now actually shifts the context and we can't actually make the correct decisions because we don't have the right amount of information. Completeness. Now, this is one that we tend to talk about a lot in this, the completeness. And what we mean by that is that we need to make a good faith effort to provide a complete, accurate, and consistent accounting of our emissions. So we want to try and include as much as we possibly can, as long as it's relevant, to be able to give and demonstrate the true impact of our carbon emissions. So sometimes there'll be a bit of a clash between completeness and accuracy, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. But really, we just want to make sure that is our carbon inventory and our carbon reporting is as complete as possible to include everything we possibly can. So up until COVID, home working emissions were generally excluded. People just didn't want it. It was hardly ever done. It wasn't really something. Since COVID and since hybrid working, that's now become actually quite a large part for a lot of organizations. So in order to remain complete and to ensure that our carbon emissions are complete, we're now looking at actually including home working emissions as part of our scope 3 to demonstrate the completeness of our impact, because we can't just no longer say that, oh, well, the building's gone down because everyone's working from home. Not our problem. We have to take into account that we've just shifted our carbon load somewhere else. So to remain complete, we have to actually include that shift as well. Consistency. So data is comparable data is needed to track emissions over time. So this is a long-term project. It's something you'll be doing over time. We'll have our baselines and we need to essentially track our performance against that baseline. Now, a baseline is only useful if the data is comparable. So if year 5 data is nothing the same as year 1 data, it's not really giving me any information. I can't compare it against anything because I'm basically comparing apples and oranges. So what we want to do is we want to ensure that we have consistency, that whatever methodologies, whatever approaches, whatever our inventory boundaries are, they remain consistent, particularly our calculation methodologies. However we calculate, obviously we can improve data, great, but the same process we go through to calculating our carbon emissions, that needs to be the same. And what's really important with inconsistency is we need to ensure that we document and justify any changes that we make. Sometimes you will have to change, for example, if your business performance or your activity changes, or maybe you as an organization, you take on a second arm, which has a completely different type of activity that you've done before. In order to remain consistent and complete, we now have to bring that in, and you would just document and justify why you've made the changes the way you have. You might need to look at rebaselining because you're a different organization now and what that means. But the most important thing is that throughout, our data is always comparable, and we have to remain consistent throughout any method that we bring in. The last two then, transparency. So when we are disclosing our information, it needs to be clearly, factually, and neutrally reported, whether that's reported within the organization, but most importantly, when that's reported externally. And one of the things that I've certainly talked to more businesses about is whether you have to legally report your carbon emissions or not, report them. Put them up on your website, talk about your carbon emissions, put them out there. As I said, your emissions are someone else's scope 3 emissions. So the more we can as organizations actually become more transparent and actually put the information out there, the easier it is for us to actually work with our partners and our supply chains, because everyone can now really readily see what the emissions associated with working with you are. And that really helps to improve partnerships. It actually helps to improve the accuracy of your value chains as well. But most importantly is that when you are putting that information out there, you want to ensure that you have the documentary, that audit trail that sits behind it, which clearly and transparently says, these are the methodologies we followed, these are the data sources in which we did, and where we have had independent external verification, these are the ones who did it, and that's what they've justified for us as well. So it just helps us to, when we're talking about it, it's really clear and easy to see what it is that we're actually talking about when we talk about our carbon emissions. And then finally, accuracy. So data should be credible enough to be useful in decision making. So whatever calculations you do, they need to be systematically neither above or below actual values. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to know what actual values are. because we may have to use estimated data, we may have to use sort of average data sets, that sort of thing. But realistically, with accuracies, we're always aiming to make our data more accurate with time. So we may start off with real basic information, but then over time, we want to improve the accuracy of that information. We don't want to use very wild old data sets, which may then actually force data to be above or below. We want to ensure that whatever we're looking at is relative, up to date, and informs the decisions that we need to make as well. But as I said before, there's a trade-off. So to be complete, we need to include all aspects. So we're talking about homeworking emissions a minute ago. So to be complete, I want to include my homeworking emissions. The problem is, it is almost impossible unless I install actual measuring equipment in people's homes to accurately record the emissions associated with them working at home. So the only opportunity I have is to use estimated data or methodology such as the EcoAct white paper, which we've spoken about in either previous webinars or certainly within our carbon footprinting part of our website. So we use that methodology to be able to estimate a value that we can associate to homeworking emissions. Now, it's not 100% accurate. And unfortunately, it's one of those things where it may never be 100% accurate. So we have to say, well, in order to be complete, we have to sacrifice that accuracy so that we can still demonstrate something. Because if we don't include homeworking emissions because we can't be accurate, well, then we can't be complete. So completeness sits above that, because ultimately that's what we want to do. We want to really demonstrate the full scope of our carbon impact, and the accuracy part is something that we can work on over time. But it's being complete, that the sort of the first aspect, and then anything else sits below that as well. Okay, so those are the 5 principles, and generally speaking, when building your inventory, those are the ones that we just always want to consider whenever we're doing it. Mostly like relevance, so we're just looking at relevant information to us, completeness, and then obviously the other ones, and then accuracy are the sort of things that we'll sort of cover in today. Now, when we're looking at scope 3 and what scope 3 means to us, the other aspect of carbon accounting is we need to understand what our boundary of our organization is. So that determines how wide a circle I create around my organization. And anything inside the circle is scope 1 and 2. Anything outside the circle is scope 3. So this is really important to understand, okay, what are the operations that we need to actually account for, and at what point do we put them? Do we include them as our scope 1, or do we include them as our scope 3 accordingly? So there are 2 approaches to consolidating this. Each consolidation approach will depending on the approach you take, you may get a different reporting requirement, and obviously different values according but that will differ depending on how complex your organization is. So for most SMEs, typically the control one is the one that's done most. It's the one that actually fits a lot of organizations, and actually it's the one that more organizations use above anything else. But there is an equity share approach, and essentially the equity share approach is where you base your emissions on the equity share you have within any given operation. So for example, if you have a 50% equity share of an organization, you would take 50% of their carbon emissions as yours. So that's what the equity share approach. It's really for organizations that perhaps maybe don't have operational controls, but have a lot of investments in organizations and have an equity share of a different companies. So they will take their carbon footprint from the share of the individual operations. But if they were to go with the control approach, because they have no control, they have no operating controls or financial controls of those organizations, it's just an investment, they would actually then end up excluding those organizations. So that would then become part of their scope 3. So the approach taken is important, because you have to really think about, well, what gives me the best picture in terms of my operation? How would I do it? And just to give you an example of that, so there's an organization I work with. Now, what they've done is they've set up a shell, essentially a shell, the best way to describe it, but they have a company name which they use to tender. Now, they're independent consultants. They do their own work and everything as well, but they use this company name to come together as independent consultants. So that company goes for tenders and that company gets work, but they still do the work as independent consultants. It's just done under this banner whenever they're delivering it. So the question they asked was, well, actually, then that company hasn't got a carbon footprint, because realistically, we do work as independents. And so the answer, I said, well, actually, if you think about it, that company has an investment in you, because the funding is coming through that organization, and that funding is essentially paying for your time. So it actually has got an equity investment in your time to deliver the project under that aspect. So when they look at their organization, the impacts associated with the work delivered under that company actually forms part of that company's carbon footprint. And so they thought, okay, they then realized that actually you can't just say, well, it doesn't have a carbon footprint because we're actually working independently. It does, because there is an ownership in their time, and that ownership actually is what it's being tendered for and working for within organizations. So that's how they would essentially measure out. So They would separate out their own performances, the amount that is associated with their company, and they would apply their carbon emission footprinting, the percentage of that investment to that organization, and that's how they would do it. However, for most SMEs, the control approach would be the one that would be used. And generally speaking, control approach is split into two areas. It's either financial control or operational control. So just as a sort of a summary to it, operational control. So financial control, this is where you as an organization, you have the ability to direct an operation's financial or operational policies to gain economic benefits. So basically, you are able to determine and actually implement financial controls that will actually change operational policy or essentially change business activity to be able to get profit out of it. Operational control is the authority to introduce and implement operating policies. So things like, operating permits, where essentially you have full control over the operations and the activities undertaken within it. Now, for a lot of SMEs, the operational control is the one that they tend to go with because the two actually sit hand in hand, with their financial and operational. But it is one of those where, depending on the size of the business and the complexity of the business, it is worthwhile having a look at the different the terms and what they mean, and actually looking at what it would give you, the different pictures it would give you if you chose one over the other. And as I said before, there's no right or wrong answer. What we're really looking to do is to ensure that whatever approach you take, the control, the operational control that you put in place gives you the best picture that's relative to you as an organization. Because anything that falls within this boundary, as I said before, is your scope 1 and 2. So that gives you your operation, that's your organizational footprint, and everything else outside of that is then scope 3. So all the other parts of your operation that aren't included in your organizational boundary now become part of your scope 3. So that determining of their boundary is important to work out actually what do I need to include at which aspect and how I go through as well. So it's the completeness part of the five principles. So once we have our operational boundary and we've identified what our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are, so we know what we are as an organization, we then start to look at the rest. Now we're looking at our scope 3. So the activity that falls outside of it becomes our scope 3. So under the GHG protocol, what they've essentially done is they've broken down the scope 3 emissions into 15 different classifications within your value chain. So these are split into 8 categories for upstream, so anything that comes into the organization, and 7 categories for downstream, so anything that leaves the organization. So upstream is essentially anything we're purchasing or anything we're bringing into the organization, which helps with our operation, whether that's a service we deliver, whether it's a product we deliver. And then downstream is exactly that. The product we deliver or the service we deliver, what are the carbon implications of that? And so we need to understand what we're buying and how much carbon sits within that. And we also need to understand what we're delivering and what carbon's associated with that. And that makes up our entire value chain. Within any product or service, and the reason there's 50 classifications, it allows you to actually break it down into it's almost granular parts, so you can actually look at each individual bit in turn. And what we can see is without any sort of product or service sector or operation, you can actually see how by, for example, if you look at technology, so the creation of technology, there is scope 1 and 2 emissions associated with the creation of the technology, but we also have to think about all the upstream, what we have to buy in, the different parts, the manufacturing of those parts. We also want to talk about the distribution of those parts. So how do they get to us? How do they leave us? We also want to talk about what's the use of those parts. If we're creating technology, who's using that technology? What are the emissions associated with, what's the energy load that product is going to actually generate? And then what's its end of life going to look like? So when people dispose of it, is it recyclable? Is it repairable? What will happen to it at its end of life? And what are the emissions associated with that as well? So we'll go through a bit more detail on this, but that just hopefully gives you a picture in terms of when we're looking at scope 3 and looking at scope 1, we can see that actually technology, what you do, that organizational boundary in terms of what you can control in your operations. But the reason why we look at the value chain is because actually it's the entire process, our entire operation sits across that band, and it's not just the little part that we look at within our organization itself. So when we start to look at scope 3, and this will vary with organizations, but we tend to see now that scope 3 actually makes up the majority of an organization's emissions. But when we're starting out, sometimes we'll actually just see the small part, because we'll have access to readily available scope 3 data like waste and water and that kind of thing. So we will have an ability to look at the sort of the direct scope 3, if you want to refer to it as that. So when we start out doing this, we'll start out looking at that information, because that's what we have readily available to us, and we can start to measure that almost straight away. as we develop this and as we start to understand and we go through the sort of processes that hopefully we'll cover today, we'll start to actually see that scope 3 band will broaden. Now, how much that broadens will depend on the organization, the complexity of your value chain, but generally speaking, for most organizations, that band will broaden quite widely, certainly above 40% of our total GHG emissions. And at that point, it's really important that we do start to account for our scope 3 within that. And then as we can see, by the time we get to year 15, that sort of scope 1 and 2 becomes smaller and smaller because we get a much better understanding of the full concept. So the reason I put this in is just to demonstrate that it is a process. Your understanding, your ability to recognize data, your ability to obtain data will change year on year as you get better at doing this, and also as data improves. So as your suppliers come on board and as they get more used to it and accurate in their reporting, that will help you within your reporting as well. So you can see how actually the value chain now becomes almost a partnership chain, and we have to start working together to really actually measure the impacts we have as we work with our clients and with our suppliers as well.
Dave, we
yes.
just had a question from Lucy, and I think it might be in relation to the previous slide, but Lucy, you might clarify. Where does customer travel sit?
Customer travel?
Yeah, I think
okay.
It might have been in the slide before that, yeah.
So anything relating to customers. So if we're selling products, that would sit in the downstream side of it. So 3.9, if you can see it on here, downstream transportation and distribution. So that's essentially related to anything as a result of the products at the point of sale. So there are some aspects we may not actually look to include, and we'll go through this in a bit more detail in some of the later slides. So we have to sort of look at, well, actually, how much of an impact does customer travel have to us? So people obviously coming to our site, that might be something we look at significance, but essentially they're coming to our site because we're selling them a service or we're selling them something. So it sits as part of the downstream aspect to it. So the transportation has both an upstream aspect, and that's the transportation of getting materials, goods, and services into our organizations so that we can operate. And then our operation has a service or a product as our output. The transportation as a result of that output or that service then falls part of our downstream. So yeah, within that itself, in terms of customer travel, it would form part of the downstream aspect to it. And then essentially you would look at what that looks like and is it possible to track that and measure that? And we'll come on to that in a bit more detail a bit later on. But yeah, so the 15 classifications does cover pretty much everything. And it's just really a question of, is it a customer? It's downstream. If it's not, if it's operational led, then it's upstream. Does that answer the question? I think it's yes.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
That's okay. No worries. Great. Okay. So yeah, as I said before, you know, the idea of scope 3 is that data will improve over time, and so our completeness of the information will improve over time. And I really want to labor on this point because, like I said, it is a process. We do need to start out at the basics and work towards improving actually what that looks like as well. But if we think back to the principles, we want to ensure completeness. So to do that, we will start to look at estimated data. We'll start to look at average data. We'll also start to look at spend. So there are data sets out there where we can actually put a spend against a sort of almost like a product code or a sector code, and that will give us an estimated carbon emissions against that value. And they're available within the UK, within the government websites. There is a data sets out there where they've actually looked at this and they've sort of calculated, roughly speaking, what the carbon emissions are associated to a value spend. The only argument with spend is that it is not very accurate because spend changes continuously, as we know now that the costs are changing almost monthly. But it does just give us a brief sort of snapshot as to where are our big ticket items, where are the sort of the big areas of carbon emissions. So it is the least accurate and also the least complex, and it's a great place to start. But then obviously with time you want to improve upon that. So we can start to look at maybe sector average data. We can also then start to maybe do a hybrid, so approaching our customers to give us information and also using some average data. We might use a bit of spend and average data, or whatever it is that we need to do in terms of how we need to mix the information together to get the best picture. But we always want to work towards that primary level data, that customer supplier led data, where we actually get accurate information back or from our suppliers or within our value chain, because that will give us the best amount of information. However, it is also the most complex. So that is what will take the long term, the long time. And what we see with a lot of large organizations, particularly massive organizations, is they're actually now almost they're working with and training and educating their supply chain to bring them on board and to help work with them to actually start to get this data so that they can get the data they want out of them, but also to benefit the organization so that they can understand what their carbon impacts are and actually make reductions. Because if you help your supply chain reduce their carbon emissions, you're reducing your scope 3 emissions almost automatically. So, you know, you can see how this now becomes that partnership-led process where we can work within our supply chain to just get better data, to work better, work more efficiently, and drive down carbon emissions across the UK and the globe, to work towards that net zero that we so desperately need. And then just finally, in terms of data sets, so these are examples of databases that you can use. So part of the information, when we're looking at data, we'll go into a bit more details. We have obviously the data of the information that we need, but we also need to think about what are the emissions factors that we use. So for the UK, we do have the DEFRA GHG conversion factors, which actually accounts for quite a lot of it. But there are also other data sets which give, you know, particularly on sectors, some sectors, for example, EcoInvent is great for construction. So there are some databases out there which are probably better for certain sectors or information, which will just probably give you a bit more accurate information than perhaps more the average sort of UK one that we have with DEFRA as well. So these are some databases. Part of the exercise to do is to think about, well, what is it the data that we have and what emissions factors do we need, and then where can we go and get them? For some of these, they are free, some are costed, and that's sort of the balance between it. But yeah, generally speaking, it's just really understanding the data process, and this is just a slide for you to look at some things as well. It's not exhaustive. There's lots of information out there. It can be a bit tricky to find, but these should cover most organizations in terms of where to get emissions information from. So I'm going to use this point now because that's sort of the introduction in terms of what we're doing, the sort of the broader concepts of thinking about your organization, thinking about your boundary, actually thinking about what forms part of your scope 1 and 2 and your scope 3, and then obviously the definitions of scopes and that as well. So do we have any questions at this point? Or is there anything in the chat, Camilla, that's been raised that we can address now?
Nothing more since Lucy's question. Is there anybody who... Go ahead, Matthew.
Thank you. Yes, the main question that comes to mind is in businesses where we have large, complex supply chains where a product supplied to us may have been processed over a number of different manufacturing sites in different countries. My question is, how far should we be going back in the supply chain? Because I think if you take any product, you know, you could go right back to the original raw materials, which are and presumably are going to be animal, vegetable, or mineral. You know, is there guidance on how far it is reasonable or practical to go back in your manufacturing supply chain when looking at the scope 3 emissions relating to product manufacture?
Yeah, great question, and it's often a question I grapple with a lot, and I will cover it a bit later on in the presentation. I refer to it as how far down the rabbit hole do we go, and yeah, so in the scope 3 GHG accounting protocol, they do have a section which actually talks about minimum boundaries. So when we start to build a scope 3 inventory, exactly that point, how far do we go down that sort of rabbit hole in terms of how much information that we need? And each of the classifications, so each of those 15 classifications has different minimum boundaries relative to what it is that you're looking for. Now, under the classification in terms of the scope 3, the reason the standard exists is because it's there to sort of unify the approach that we take as organizations, so that actually we're all singing off the same hymn sheet. So my scope 3 is actually relevant to your scope 3, and there isn't sort of differences between them. Wherever those differences do exist, justified and disclose them as part of our transparency piece. But yes, so in terms of, we talk about the purchase of goods, so we talk about the purchase of material information, the minimum boundary is the cradle to gate emissions. So by cradle to gate, we mean literally from the creation of that part to you as the purchaser, and that's the cradle to gate process that we use. Now, it can sometimes come down to where you sit within that, but realistically, and one of the things that are so there's another protocol. So within all of this, there are different protocols that sit on top of each other, but there is one called the Life Cycle Products Protocol, which is actually addressing that particular question. So in order to determine what the carbon emissions are for a piece of for a product that I purchased to come to me, I need to understand its life cycle. So what is the actual carbon emissions that have gone into the production of that material before I got it? So there are now processes and protocols in place with manufacturing businesses, particularly, to actually start to develop these life cycle analysis and assessments, so that you as a purchaser, when you buy a product, you'll be able to get that information. At the moment, there is information out there. There are life cycle data sets for different products and different materials. It doesn't cover everything, but it does cover quite a large amount of materials. So for the moment, estimated data is the best way of doing that. Sort of data sets and sort of some of the ones that we showed earlier, those sort of data sets will have some of that information for you. But ideally, with time, and as we sort of flesh out this process and as organizations come on board, those data sets will then become more accurate. So as we move forward in time, we'll actually get a much clearer understanding in terms of all the different stages that have gone into its manufacturing that I use. So the question obviously comes up within food manufacturing as well. So if I'm ordering food or purchasing like a material that I'm then selling, what are all the processes, like the growing aspect, like what were the farmers' inputs to it? What was the distribution inputs into it? What was the processing push into it? So you as an organization wouldn't go to every single one of those suppliers throughout that chain, because that could be anywhere across the world. So what you will be relying on are these life cycle data sets to give you that information, to then say, okay, well, if we bought this material, the life cycle data set says the carbon associated to it is this, and therefore we'll use that as our carbon emissions going forward. And with time, that information will be improved upon.
Okay, thank you. I think that's interesting. Yeah, that prompts another question in my
Sure.
mind. So these data sets, let's say we take there is data for, say, a plastic bottle. Now presumably, as no, actually, I'm going to pick a different example. Say, let's take an item that might be manufactured out of steel. Now, I think it's reasonable to assume that the steel manufacturer won't be decarbonized by 2030. I'd love to think it would. So you were going to be faced with emissions that where although we may be able to reduce them, it's very unlikely we're going to hit zero by 2030. But presumably, as the whole industry and different industries do achieve a level of decarbonisation, I would expect that the data in these data sets would start to show lower carbon emissions. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, we can just looking at the UK grid as an example. So the electricity that we produce within the UK over the last however many years is slowly but surely becoming more and more renewable. And we've seen this within the conversion factors. So if we look at the conversion factors for electricity back in 2014, it was 0.4. So 0.4 kilograms of CO2 for every kilowatt of energy that was being consumed. Now it's down to 0.19. So we can actually see that just within 2014 to now, 8 years, we've seen a drop in terms of the emissions associated with just using electricity. So me as a supplier, if I'm using electricity to create or to do a certain process, just by naturally the decarbonisation of the UK grid, my products that I'm putting energy into are naturally becoming low and low carbon relative to it. And this is what will happen across the board as technology improves, as decarbonisation occurs, as we maybe get crack better lower emission fuels to be able to produce the energy loads for some of the manufacturing processes. That will naturally have a knock-on effect to the carbon associated with the products and materials that we're doing. And there are problematic sectors. Steel, as you've mentioned, cement is a significantly carbon intensive industry. They will be the slowest and probably the last if they ever get to zero carbon, and that may never be a case. But in answer to your question, yes, these data sets that we have, they will improve over time, because naturally speaking, as we all put investment and innovation and all the things that we're doing together to decarbonize the world, they will have the knock-on effect. So those data sets today won't be the same data sets in, say, 15 years time. And this is the important thing, is the data sets as they exist at the moment, they are estimated. They do take into account a few aspects, and there's also lots of data points that inform a data set. So it's sometimes there can be an average of an average. So they're not 100% accurate, but it just gives us a good idea in terms of where we are now. And the idea is that by actually one of the, I guess, the intended consequence of net Zero to some degree is by actually getting suppliers or businesses, just businesses as a whole, to take into account their carbon emissions. We can now actually get far better accurate data points to feed into these data sets. So me, as if I'm buying a piece of equipment of someone in America somewhere, they could tell me, well, here's the carbon emission associated with this piece of equipment. I can say, okay, well, that's how much carbon. Great. This is how much I've put into it. That's how much they've put into it. So by the time you get it, you have 6 accurate data sets that tell you exactly how much carbon's gone into the manufacturing and delivering of that piece. That will take time, and we are working towards getting there. So yeah, within time, it is reasonable to expect that the carbon emissions associated with anything that's manufactured will come down, and the information, the accuracy of that information will hopefully improve. And that's sort of the exercise that the GHG protocol and other bodies are working towards doing, so that we can get to a point where that data is almost readily available at a touch of a button.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Thanks.
Or comments?
Yeah, Dave, we've got 3 more questions that have come in.
Sure.
I'll do one and then the other 2 together. So Abby has asked, do you have a view at all on Ecology Zero for calculating Scope 3 and working in tandem with IIE methodologies? And I guess my additional question is, are you going to talk about smart carbon at some point? Maybe you answer that later, but.
Sorry, can you say the question again? I missed the beginning of it.
So do you have a view at all on Ecology Zero for calculating Scope 3 emissions and working in tandem with IIE methodologies?
Okay. Yeah. So it's often a question I come across, and I've seen this with organizations where, I guess the way to think about it is that different data sets, different software programs and that kind of stuff, if they give you information that you need, absolutely. Now, the process of IAE and what we want to do with organizations in IAE is to be able to look at our management of these things. So the environmental management system structure that we put in place, they follows a simple pathway in terms of understanding our drivers and our business objectives, measuring, setting in place targets, the standard process we all go through as IAE members. The ability to use different data sets, to use different platforms, to use different sources of information, well, that just feeds into the system that we're already managing. So yeah, it's not a conflict or a competitive, and dovetails quite nicely within it. So I don't know Ecology Zero, I don't know the system, so I can't comment specifically on that. But if that's able to allow you to plug the data that you've already captured with IAE into a system, and it gives you the information you need to make informed decisions, that just feeds back into the system as well. So yes, the use, and I refer to like the net zero standard and the GHG protocol. So these are all standards and things that you can undertake, and they all work nicely within IE, because the process you go in terms of developing your management system and how you systematically look at your performance and what it is that you need to do, they're just sources of information and guidance pieces that helps to inform the way in which you do that. So yeah, absolutely. If there's we have a smart carbon platform, which is essentially a carbon capture system. It allows you to put in quite a lot of different data sets, from actual data to estimated data to Scope 3 data as well. There's a huge section around Scope 3 and actually capturing Scope 3 inputs to give emissions off the back of that as well. The information you get out of that allows you to now make informed decisions. So what is it that I need to do? So if I look at my Scope 3 breakdown, where are my hotspots, and how do I now use my IE processes in terms of development and action planning to actually target those areas and drive down performances where I need to as well. So yeah, it all comes together. And I think, we can't certainly take credit for inventing it. A lot of the stuff we take is actually just shared information across multiple platforms. So there are so many different places to go to now to get information, to get support, and it all is essentially the same information. It's just some people, put it together in a particular way than others, and that might work well for your business. So even as organizations, we all have different needs, and we might find those needs satisfied through different routes. So some might prefer one software, some might prefer another, because the software meets their business requirements and their needs, but all of it forming into this sort of system that we develop as part of IE to allow us to make the decisions and actually drive forward the improvements that we want to as well.
Brilliant. And then the other 2 there's a sort of linked, I think, from Lucy. For pensions, do you factor only employer contributions or employee contributions as well? And then can taxation, business or individual, be counted? That'll test you, Dave.
It will test me. I don't think I can answer the taxation question off the bat now. I might need to look at that in further detail. As for the pension, so Typically, when we're looking at scope 3, I mean, you can break it down to whatever detail you want. I would probably say with pensions, you would just be looking at the total investment of the funds from both employer contributions, because realistically, it's the investment of the pensions and where that's being invested that's ultimately determining the carbon emissions associated, and also the ethical points of it. So are they investing in the right type of things that for you as an organization suits your ethical requirements as part of your SDG process as well? So yeah, it would be total value, I would have thought, rather than necessarily having to separate it down between what the employers put in, what the employees put in, because what we're looking for investment is that it's that sort of, where is it being invested, what impact does that have, and do we potentially want to continue to invest with the company we're with, or are there other investors out there that actually would be a better place to, because one, they're more ethical in terms of what they invest in, and two, also are either doing more around their own carbon emissions, etc. as well. And then the taxation one, great question. I'll take it away, and if whoever asked the question, we can get back to you on that.
Brilliant, thanks.
Cool.
It's Lucy.
Okay.
We'll get back to Lucy.
Okay, perfect. Great. Okay, so I'm cracking on then. So what we're looking for now then is, so we've talked about the sort of the introduction to scope 3 and what we're looking for as for an organization, and sort of just the introduction to a lot of this. So what we're going to focus on this section is around the planning aspect of it. So now that we've identified what is our scope 1 and 2, and what we identified what is our scope 3, what we need to do is we need to actually map that out. So this is a really useful exercise, and it's particularly if you have a larger or more complex value chain, but also it's just a useful exercise, I think, for us to all do as organizations. So this exercise uses all the parts that we've discussed so far. So what we want to do is think about your business operation and activity. So what is it that your scope 1 and 2 is on site, and what are you doing within that? And then look at your upstream activities, and using the first 8 of the classifications, determine which of those classifications are most relevant to your operation. So you build a map or a list of each of those different classifications, and then with each of those, think about the products or services that you're purchasing that fit within each of those categories, and who the suppliers or relevant partners are within them. So that's the first exercise. We're just mapping out essentially what we do. This is what we do as an organization, which for IAE members, we should have already sort of loosely done within our explanation documents and that kind of stuff. And what we're doing now is we're thinking about, okay, what is it that was coming into the organization, whether it's a service, whether it's a product, and we use those classifications to help you break them down into the individual components. The information is in the slide. We'll come into them in a bit more detail a bit later on, and then think about, okay, well, what are those products, what are those services, and who is it that I'm actually purchasing them off? So you sort of build that sort of part of the process, and then you repeat the exercise for your downstream activities. But what I will say with downstream is that there are differences. So if you're developing a product, that will have a different sort of chain to if you're just delivering a service. Not all services are significant in terms of their carbon impact. So particularly within IT, yes, the server you have will sort of a large aspect to it, but working with businesses, helping them improve their IT skills, that kind of stuff doesn't really necessarily have a significant carbon impact, or at least one that's not necessarily easy to measure. So it may be a case of actually identifying and say, well, hang on a minute, what we're delivering as a service, we can't really see where there's a classification. So when we're doing this exercise, and the reason I bring it up is because we want to consider the weighting of the importance in terms of its impact and what influence we have. So we're looking only to include sources that are significant across different criteria. So we want to first map out, our value chain in terms of all the people that we work with, including our customers. And we don't necessarily obviously name individual customers, but roughly speaking, what is that we're delivering? What is it we're bringing in, and what that looks like as an organization? And then we want to weight that in terms of its significance. Now, to do that, there's a criteria, as I said, within the GHG protocol that allows us to go through these sort of steps to identify what is it that's most important to me that I need to include as part of my scope 3 emissions inventory. So first thing we want to talk about is the size of the impact. How big a carbon impact does that have? Now, there are systems you can use to estimate that. The SPEN system, there's a program online called the Qantas Scope 3 Evaluator tool. It's available through the GHG protocol, but you can get the same information through a UK website, which is in the useful links right at the end of this presentation. I'll go through that page. There is one you can go into. You can basically, it gives you classification of different SIC codes, and it gives you basically what the cost in terms of how much you spend and how much of a carbon impact that has. And it's a great way just to start understanding how big a carbon footprint each of these different spends have as you as an organization. The next thing we want to think about is the influence. So actually, how much of an influence do we have in terms of impacting or influencing the control over that sort of carbon emissions? Ideally, you want to do both. You want to have both a large impact in terms of GHG emissions, but also a large influence in terms of how you can control that. But we want to think about impact first, and then also consider if we do have a very good influence over a particular stream, of a particular inventory point, then that's something we may want to include, because if we have got a good influence, it's something we can almost do straight away. And then we just start to go down the list and thinking about, well, what is a risk to the organization? Is there anything that actually we really should include because it's a massive risk to us? So for example, there could be a compliance or regulatory requirement for us to do something. So waste as an example. If we have regulations around what we do and how we manage our waste, that could be something that we look to include as part of that. We also want to think about our stakeholders. So do we actually have requirements put upon us by our customers or by our stakeholders, suppliers or investors, that we need to really ensure that we include, because that actually helps us in terms of our reputation, which could also fall into the risk category as well. Are we outsourcing anything? So are we actually, are we moving part of our operation off somewhere else, and therefore do we need to? So outsourcing kind of fits nicely with home working emissions. It's not quite the same thing, but if we think about it, we've kind of separated part of our carbon footprint to be done elsewhere that we don't actually have control over. But also thinking about if we do work with partners, or we've given part of our operation to them to do it, maybe from a cost perspective, well, we do probably need to include that as part of our carbon emissions, because again, like we said, we haven't necessarily reduced our carbon impact, we've just shifted it to somewhere else. And then obviously, if there's any sector guidance, so if you're in particular industries, there may be a requirement for you to report a particular type of carbon emission, and then anything else that potentially has relevance in terms of what it is that you're doing. So we're working down this list, and the reason we're doing this is because we don't necessarily, yes, it'd be great to complete everything and include everything, but like I said, this is a process we want to develop over time. We want to focus on our big impacts, our big influence areas first of all, and so we want to ensure that when we're building our inventory, we're focusing on that almost at the forefront, and we can develop and build the rest as we move through time and introduce them, whether we do that over the next couple of years or whatever that process looks like. But we really want to ensure that we're including the most relevant information to us, going back to our principles, the most relevant, giving us the completeness, and really looking at where we have significant impact or significant influence. If something has a relatively very low carbon impact and actually to the point where it's almost negligible, then we could obviously we justify as part of a transparency and say that we've not included this because it only makes up, say, less than 5% of our total carbon footprint. And so for now, we're excluding it, but we may look to pick it up in later time. Then that's fine. Again, we're looking at the sort of big ticket items to start with when we're doing it. So as I said before, these are sort of the 15 categories. So we have the upstream ones, we have the downstream ones, and in here we have, within this example here, there's also levers to consider in terms of how to reduce the emissions. But once we've gone through this exercise and we've created this map in terms of our total value chain, and we started to think about, well, where are the core value, where are the really sort of top topic items that we need to look at first of all and really sort of take on board, we can now start to think about, okay, well, these are the different information points that we need. The next thing is we also have to think about the data. Where are we going to get the data from? How is the data going to come into us? And then we also need to start to think about, well, actually, Kate, how do we start to improve and reduce these things? So that could be where we want to speak to our supply chain or our suppliers or our customers or whatever it is that we need to do. So we start with the process of mapping. We then start to think about where we're getting the information from and how can we actually start to make decisions from this information. And then we start to think about, well, what are the mitigation actions that we need to introduce to start to work towards making improvements in this. Now, the mitigation part will take the longest point because it probably will require a lot of collaboration, a lot of confirmation, a lot of conversation. And this is a business approach. So whilst you as an individual might be responsible for doing it, it does need to involve the facets of the organization, because when you're talking about purchasing, you need procurement and finance there, you need senior management there, you need all of the relevant people responsible for doing this in the room together, talking about this to identify what is it that can be done, what can be looked at, what needs to be done, who do we need to speak to, what conversations do we need to make as well. Now, it needs to be an organizational approach when we do this, so that we're all working together to really identify and find out what is we can do and how do we start to mitigate that as well. So as an example, in terms of materiality assessments, so where you can, using your supply specific data, you want to start to look at where your largest emissions reside. So in the first instance, we may not have supply specific data, so we'd probably just be using estimated data, but realistically, we want to identify our hotspots. So where is it that actually most of our carbon emissions are situated? And then what do we need to do? We also want to, as I said, we want to look at that data and we want to focus efforts on improving that data. So we're using estimates for now. How is it we get that better? Where are we getting our emissions factors from? And then what are we doing in terms of actually calculating that? So you also want to then consider areas where you have that potential to communicate and influence. So we've worked out our big impacts. We then want to think about, well, where is it that we can actually communicate and influence almost immediately? Where's that sort of big ticket item, and what is it that we need to do that? Now, it may be actually our customers are an easy one to discuss and talk to and actually influence. It might be that actually we've had a supplier we've been working with for 20 years and we have such a good relationship that actually they would be a great one to start working with as well. So the idea of this within the example itself is, as I said, it's to look at you as an organization, to look at what it is that you need to include within those sort of categories and identify, to then think about what are the sort of the weighted objects, what are the ones that we want to do, and then start to take that forward through our actions, through our action plans, through our communication, and taking it forward from that point as well. And obviously within that graph, we can see actually identifying hotspots. So this is a bit more detailed, probably where you have quite a complex value chain. You don't need to go into as much detail as this, but it's nice to, if you can map it out in this way and actually demonstrate where the sort of big hotspot items exist, just helps you with your information when going forward as well. So as I said, Scope 3 is made up of several sources of emissions, and many of those emission reductions exist and can be applied to one of many categories. So where we're looking to reduce this, these methods can be used together depending on the emissions hotspots and can have an impact in several categories. So in this example we have, so if we're looking at category 1, so we look at the different categories and we want to think about, okay, well, where are opportunities for us to make improvements? So within category 1, there's sort of 3 things that we can look at. We have our procurement strategy, which can look at either low carbon product shifts, so actually shifting the products we're buying in for low carbon alternatives. It could be a low carbon supplier shift. It might actually be that the supplier we're working with is quite energy intensive, and actually there's another supplier who provides us with the same materials but has a lower carbon footprint because they've just invested in different technologies. It could also then be in supplier engagement. So we've taken category 1, we've looked at what do we have, we thought about, okay, well, what are the different options we have available to us? We can either shift the product, we can shift the supplier, or we can engage with the supplier and improve them overall. And then from that, we then work out what's the best route for us to take to start to improve information, to start to drive down these reductions that we need as well. We can also start to think of, in some of the other categories, things like business model innovation. So what is it that we're doing as an organization? What kind of activities or services are we doing? Are there any that we could potentially change, or actually change the way in which we operate them to be able to reduce our carbon footprint? If you're a manufacturer or a producer, what are your looking at your product or service design? So what materials are you using? What materials could we bring in to be low carbon? How are we producing? What can be done? Or is there a way to actually produce that project more efficiently or more effectively? Or even if you're looking at our supply chain, our customers, can we make our product improve the efficiency of their products depending on where we sit within our value chain? We could look at customer engagement. We could look at waste management. You could look at investment strategy. So overall, we can apply a lot of the stuff that we probably already do from a business perspective, and certainly also things that we do as part of the IIE process that we go through, and actually start to apply it to these different categories to start to identify where there's opportunities for us to start to make these improvements. And most importantly is that communication piece of actually working with our suppliers to improve data, because I think that will be a large part for most of us to start from when we start to do this. So most organizations, so obviously some organizations will have complex supply chains, and as approach, we need to prioritize and quantify the emissions and then to decarbonize. And there is a bit of flexibility into how we approach that, and we can base that either on spend or on carbon intensity or even duration of supplier relationships. So we could essentially build a sort of a cross graph, and we can put into it the different suppliers that we have, and we can think about actually which of these suppliers are we spending the most money with, which of these suppliers are most carbon intensive for us, which of these suppliers are we actually going to have the longest, or do we want to maintain that relationship with? And we can actually scatter the suppliers across, thinking, okay, these are the ones that we want to engage with first. We spend the most of money with them, they're the most carbon intensive, and we're going to spend as much time as we can with them because they're a great supplier to work with. So they're the ones that we're going to categorize and actually identify as being the ones that we approach first. So that allows us to actually then look at what suppliers we're working with, put them into a place, and then think about what it is that we can do to sort of work with them. And there's various approaches that we can take. Some of these approaches will come down to business size. So the larger you are, you probably have more leverage. So for example, you could enforce change. Now we're seeing this within the NHS as a particular example. So not necessarily enforcing, but it's almost a circumstance where we need you to be more carbon friendly. We're going to work with you to help you to do that. But in order to stay within our supply chain, you need to be showing us the effort that you're doing it. It could be supportive. So exactly that sort of balance between actually encouraging them to do something and then supporting them. So you can provide them with toolkits, information, help them understand their carbon emissions. We've seen some great examples. So I think Siemens, they have a sort of an education program that they work with their suppliers to help them understand their carbon emissions, and that helps them feed into their value chain as well. So there are examples of large organizations out there that are using this as almost a method to help understand them. You also see there's an opportunity potentially, for example, if you are a large organization, you have a lot of suppliers, like getting them to develop environmental management systems or energy management systems, getting them to work in the same process that you guys are doing to actually develop their understanding and their information, and then together collaboratively you can work on making the improvements that you need to as well. There's also collaboration methods that you can use. Most importantly within this as well, as I said, it does need to move away from perhaps thinking of it as a supply chain to more of a partnership chain. So we really want to get to a point where we are all talking to each other, where suppliers understand your needs, you understand suppliers' needs, and together you can come to solutions that benefit both of you. So, we don't always need to just shift and swap and change suppliers. Sometimes actually just by working with them and taking them through the process, showing them how easy the process can be. Because remember, you're really just interested in the scope 1 and 2 emissions. That's what you're really fundamentally interested in the first instance. So helping them just do that step of the process instantly gives you data that you can then start to use going forward as well. And then obviously, monitoring, constantly communicating with them, making sure that there's a communication chain as well, so they can communicate with you just as easy as you can communicate with them, and maintaining that relationship as well. And then it might even be a question of saying, look, what we'd like to do is every year, you just let us know your carbon footprint, just send us a report every year so we know where you are, and then we can just continue to work in that basis as well. So coming back to the point that you made, so how far down the rabbit hole do you go? So there are minimum boundaries are set within the GHG protocol guidance. And essentially within each classification, there are sort of depths that you need to go to. Now I have got all 15 listed here. I probably won't go through all of them, but just to give you an example of the type of thing. So if you are purchasing goods and services, so this is essentially the extraction, production, and transportation of goods and services purchased or acquired by you as the reporting company within your reporting year, not otherwise classified in any of the other categories. So this is all upstream, and what we need to include, the minimum boundary is all upstream emissions that's cradle to gate from the purchased goods and services. So that's the minimum boundary set within that category. Now, one of the most relevant for us is fuel, the purchase of fuel and the purchase of energy. And the minimum boundary is essentially the inclusion of well-to-tank and transmission and distribution emissions, as well as any generation emissions that are not associated with scope 1 and 2. So the UK government already gives us this information within the conversion factor sheets that we get, but the minimum boundary one. So whenever we're buying fuel and energy, we want to ensure that our scope 3 includes well-to-tank and transmission distribution emissions associated with that as well. If we're purchasing any sort of generation of a secondary supplier, we want to ensure that we include their emissions that otherwise we wouldn't capture within our own first scope 1 and scope 2 as well. So for a lot of us, particularly if we're using the IEE carbon calculator, that's already included in that. So you're already doing that part, and that's as far as you need to go. You don't need to go any further than that. In terms of transportation, so if you're purchasing in goods and services, you essentially want to look at the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the transportation and distribution providers that occur during use of vehicle and facilities. And what I mean by facilities, if that good's being stored, the storage of those goods needs to be included within that process, and then also the delivery of the goods needs to be included in that process. Now, in terms of fuel and energy, for example, if it's an electric vehicle, you want to include the electricity associated with that, and if it's obviously a fossil fuel, then associated with that. Now, you can estimate that data, or hopefully they can provide you with that data, and that's what I mean. We need to get to a point where actually they can tell us how long was that in the storage? So from when we purchased it, how long was that in storage for? What was the energy associated with the storage of those goods? What are the energy associated with the transportation of those goods? And that again gives you that footprint for that transportation distribution to you from purchasing that product. Now, interestingly, for waste generated in operations, The minimum boundary is the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the waste management suppliers that occurs during the disposal and treatment. It doesn't actually require you to report on the travel of waste. That's optional. So really what we just want from our waste suppliers, realistically, is actually the scope 1 and 2 emissions from their waste management in terms of their disposal and treatment. So how much energy is going into them managing that waste and disposing of that waste, and that's really what we want to account for. So often we want to almost change the conversation we have with our waste suppliers to actually understand what their carbon impacts are for them managing that waste. Business travel, I think we already do have. So obviously the scope 1 and 2 emissions for transportation of travel for our staff. So, you know, any travel that they do as part of business travel, what are the emissions associated with their travel? So a lot of us already do that. And the same with employee commuting. What essentially is the carbon emissions associated with them traveling to and from work as well? That employee commuting has an optional section which talks about working from home. So there is actually an optional for us to start to include home working as part of the employee commuting aspect to these categories. And then it basically goes on, but roughly speaking, it's the same thing. And throughout all of the categories, it always comes down to the scope 1 and 2 emissions associated with either the storage, the process, or the distribution and delivery of those goods or services that we're essentially purchasing. And it's the same downstream as well. So if we're selling to a particular manufacturer and they're using our products and services, we want to associate that. We want to understand the scope 1 and 2 emissions going into their manufacturing of their part as part of their product, and we want to include that within our thing as well. So there is a link in the useful slides which will take you to the protocol. So you know, for those who want to look into it in more detail, it's a lot of information. I didn't want to put it in the slides. I've included the link, and it's something there to look at. And it's chapter, if I remember correctly, it's chapter 5, minimum boundaries, is what you're looking for within that as well. But again, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk about that outside of this and actually take you through that if you want a bit more information. But yeah, so we don't have to necessarily go to the nth degree and capture absolutely everything, but we are always looking at scope 1 and 2, particularly within our tier 1 supply chain and potentially maybe our tier 2, depending on what we need. But realistically, we kind of want their information to help inform us of the total impact that we have as organizations. So just come to this point to take a break in terms of what I've been talking about. I always feel conscious that it's just literally me waffling on about lots of stuff, and these are quite sort of big sort of items and sort of aspects. But do we have any questions from anyone?
Lucy's asked one. I am not sure. I'll try and relate it and get the emphasis right. So if you're a large organization where a small proportion of your total carbon is a considerable amount of carbon, especially compared to a small organization, should we count it?
So it is relative to your organization rather than it being relative to, you know, a one-man band down the street. You're right. The idea is that so under the GHG protocol, what it says is to try to limit your exclusions to around about 5% of your total carbon footprint. And 5%, if you're a massive organization, could be hundreds of tons compared to another organization. So it is relative to you. So it's your total carbon footprint. So if your total carbon footprint, say 500 tons, then that 5% is relative to your 500 tons, not to anyone else, because it's obviously relative to your impacts and what you can do as well. The key thing, as I said before, within this is that we focus first on those heavy impact areas. The idea being that like we can't necessarily tackle everything at once. You know, we don't necessarily have the resource to do that. So we want to really identify as part of our inventory, we may include it, but we probably want to weight our process and our performance to actually the real big financial, significant impact, influential, and that sort of thing as well. So we may exclude it initially, but it will be something that we probably will bring back in later on once we can either get the data or once these other ones come down and we start to actually make changes so that those carbon emissions, then that smaller one becomes bigger in terms of our overall footprint. So that then might fall into the category of, okay, it now fits in and we have to manage it as well. So as we develop this with time, our carbon points of reference, our carbon understanding and what we include will also change as we improve some bits, or maybe other bits will then become bigger. So we have to improve those bits. And so we basically take in turn to push our carbon in, or all the different bits that stick out. It probably a visual analogy I can give you. I'm not sure if it's a great one, but yeah, it is relative to your organization. So you're looking at your operations within your value chain. What are the significant impacts relevant to you? not compared to someone else. Unless it's a requirement, for example, that maybe a shareholder says, no, you need to include that because that's a risk for us, so that you could include it that way. So, any other questions?
Thanks, Dave. There's no other questions that have come up in the chat, but has anybody else got some they'd like to ask right now? No?
Okay, I shall crack
Okay.
on. Okay, so we've obviously spoken about data. So like everything else, any of our carbon accounting, data is absolutely vital. The only way we can really understand our impacts is by understanding the data and actually having good, accurate data. The problem is, unfortunately, particularly because of what we're talking about, the scope 3 aspect, that accurate data is not going to be necessarily possible in the first instance. It probably will take a bit of time to get there, and that's okay. It's understood, it's accepted, and obviously we want to just make sure that we're doing what we can to improve upon that over time. So as part of our strategy and as part of our process, we're always identifying what data are we missing, what data do we need, and then what is it we need to do to improve that data. So the data essentially is broken down into 2 types. There's primary data, which is supplier provided data. So that's actually data coming from your value chain. That could be either actual, say, for example, energy, or it could be carbon calculations. And then secondary data is everything else. So that's industry averages, that's either published data sets, government statistics, research literature, anything like that. So we will probably all start with secondary data in one form or another as we start to sort of understand our initial aspect of scope 3. And then over time, as we work within this process and work with suppliers, we'll shift that towards primary data. And that's a lot of what the large organizations who have been doing this for some time now have really been doing, is actually working on shifting that data point from secondary to primary data to give them much more useful information. So yeah, whatever data you use, ensure that you are transparent. So as I come back to that transparency thing, so whatever data sets you use, whatever information you use, make sure it's transparent. Make sure you record all that information, particularly for audit purposes. So if anybody questions where you got your data from, you can say, look, here we go. Here's our data sources. This is where we got the information from, and this is how we calculate it. So there's that clear methodology throughout. And also, if you do decide to look for external validation, whoever that is can actually come in and actually see the methodology you've applied, and obviously validate to say, yeah, actually what you've done is correct, and we validate that accordingly. So these are some examples of what's considered as primary and secondary data. It's just the first 8, just to give you an example. So this is within the GHG protocol, and it just gives you examples of what you could include as primary data and what you could include as secondary data against each of the different classifications. The next thing to think about is that whilst data might be primary or secondary, particularly secondary data, we also have to think about the quality of that data. So yes, we might be able to get average data sets, but how good a data set is that? And is that data set actually relevant to us? This might come back to the point that you made earlier, Matthew, in terms of, if we're looking at life cycle data sets, how old is that data set? And if it's done in 2008, that's not relative to what it is now. So we always want to ensure that whatever data sets we are using, whatever information we're using, is as up to date as we can possibly get it. Now, that's not always possible, particularly if we're looking at like research data. If what we're actually looking at is quite nuanced or niche or very unique to our organization, it might require information that's slightly older than we would like it to be. But this is a graph. It's taken from so I can't actually read that. It's taken from this life cycle inventory, and it's a great way of actually thinking about how good the data is. So when we're actually looking at data, there's certain things that we might want to think about in terms of, is it very good data? And we can kind of break that down into different sections. So as part of technology, it's essentially the degree to which the data set reflects the actual technology we're using. So as part of that data set, does it talk about the same kind of system or technology that you're using, or is it something very different? In which case, is it as good as it could be? When we talk about temporal representative, we're talking about the degree to which the data reflects the actual time or age or of activity. So how far away in time was that? Is that relative to current? Are circumstances different now from when that data set was first derived? When we talk about geography, is that data set actually located to our country? So I did a piece of work, we were looking at food waste, we were looking at carbon impacts of food, and a lot of the data sets were actually European. So some of them were relevant and could be included because actually the processes, when we looked at the processes undertaken, they matched what we wanted, but they had different energy grids. So their actual carbon impacts for the way that they did things was different to the way we would do things in the UK, just simply because of the way that the energy is generated. So we do have to also think about, where is this data set come from? What's the geography? Does it actually match what we want as well? In terms of completeness, so this is the degree to which the data is statistically representative of the relevant activity. So does it actually give us everything we need? So for example, if we need cradle to gate data sets, sometimes it might not necessarily have certain aspects. It might not always be to gate. It might be from cradle to farm gate. So if we're looking at food again as an example, it might not necessarily be to gate to us. It might only be to farm gate. So that's literally just the carbon associated with the growth and production within the farmer's process, but not necessarily the rest of the set information to getting that food to us. So we do want to make sure that actually the completeness of that information actually covers what we want and is relevant to our activity. And then reliability. So who's produced this data set? Where has that information come from? Is it a dependable source? If it's a research article, has that been peer reviewed? What does that peer review process look like? Have any failings been identified that actually could impact the other sort of aspects to it, and therefore not become as reliable data as we want it to as well? So realistically, and this is why the reason I'm actually trying to get to primary data is ideal. For most parts though, you know, with all of us, we're all kind of stuck in the same point where the data sets we have available to us are the data sets we have available to us. So it is a little bit of a flexibility at this point. There may be certain things that we are just going to have to heavily estimate because that's literally all the information we have. But identifying it, recognizing it, and then putting in points to try and improve upon that, that's obviously what we're doing as part of the exercise that we want to do as well. And that over time, we can either start to shift the primary data or just improve where we get our information from to be able to improve our understanding of the emissions and the measuring of the impact that they have as well. Finally, then, when we're looking at data, this is an element to how much of that data is actually relevant to us. So when we now, so the other side of the problem we have is that if we then move to primary data, that primary data may not necessarily give us the exact information that we want. And for this, and the easy way to think about it is that, for example, I work my supply chain and I say to them, okay, what is your scope 1 and 2 emissions? And they give me their total scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, I'm not responsible for all of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. I'm just one person purchasing of them. There might be 20 other people. So realistically, I only need a proportion of their total carbon impact. And I only really want to know the proportion of carbon impact directly related to what I've purchased through them. So we do have to, when we look at primary data, think about how do we allocate the emissions across the sort of the value chain. So your scope 1 and 2 emissions, if you sell to 3 people, it could be a case of actually, I can look at the carbon emissions associated with the production and what I'm selling, and I can give each of you a third. So those are your allocated scope 3 emissions. But that might not necessarily be relevant because there may be certain aspects where actually my total energy share over the 3 doesn't quite count because I'm also doing other service activity which isn't related to my products, but I haven't got that information separated out. So we do have this problem where with primary data, it may be a very big data set that we now have to share out between them. So as much as possible, allocation should be avoided, but it is likely that whatever happens, we are just going to get a series of single data sets from suppliers, and we're going to need to essentially calculate how much of that we take on board. So some manufacturers may be able to put in sub-metering in certain processes and different ways of improving how they capture and collect their data, and are therefore actually able to give you information. So for example, Hewlett-Packard, they can actually tell you the carbon emissions associated with every computer they sell to you. So every computer I buy, they will give me the actual carbon emissions that's gone into the manufacture of that computer. So that's ideal, and that's where we'd love to be, but we have to appreciate that that's not going to be relevant for everybody. We are going to have to essentially look at how we allocate the information accordingly. So when we are allocating data, as always, there are guidance out there. So we do just want to think about what are the different ways that we can essentially allocate that. And there's 3 sort of core headings that we can do that with. There's the physical allocation, the economic allocation, and then there's just other methods. If there's anything else that actually works best for us that we could either from an industry specific information or anything else that we could potentially allocate to how we get that information to us as well. So realistically, when we're doing this and we start to go through these exercises, you might want to actually try the different methods and see which one works best for you to give you the most. And again, it's the most relevant and the most realistic sort of impact in terms of what you take into account. Ideally, we want to try work with the supply chain to be able to give us more broken down information, to give us more specific information, but that may not be possible. So we will have to do this to account. As part of the transparency, whichever methodology we take is a methodology that we then stick with for our consistency, and that we just actually report and adhere to that as part of our transparency. So as always, there may be very wrong ways of doing it, but I think it's a question of like thinking about what it is that you want to account, thinking about what it is that your objective is when doing this, and thinking about, okay, what of all of these gives us the most relevant and realistic information to ensure that we're accounting for actually what we feel is our accurate input to the amount of carbon emissions associated with working with the supplier as well. And so I say it may be possible or necessary to run several evaluations to determine which allocation method is best before then saying, yep, that's the one we're going to go, and we'll do that from that point there. And then just finally, in terms of allocating emissions, oh, hello, sorry. For some reason the slide's in there twice. So that's it really. So yeah, so we're looking at data, we're looking at where data comes from, we're looking at improving data with time. As I said, it is a stage process. We will start with estimated data and slowly work to improving that data. That all comes down to supplier engagement and working with our suppliers and looking to help them measure their carbon impact so they can feed it into us. And there's lots of exercise going on with that at the moment through the NHS, through the public procurement notice and things like this as well. But also as organizations, we do have that opportunity to sort of build these partnerships and these collaboration approaches that we can all work together to help each other. And then also once we have the data, we also need to think that we wouldn't take on their total scope 1 and 2 as our scope 3, because that's not relevant. It's not realistic. We need to also think about, well, actually, how much of that would I take? The economic one is one we tend to see a lot of. So if your carbon emissions are 20 tons and I'm 10% of the investment into those 10 tons, I'll just take 10% of your carbon emissions as my invested proportion of your carbon emissions. So we do tend to see that one being used quite a lot, but it might not necessarily always be the most relevant. That's why there are different ones you can consider. Do that as an exercise. Once you have and that's when you have the primary data, you do that as an exercise to work out the best allocation method that gives you the best information. Any questions?
Hi, David, it's Matthew. Regarding the data that suppliers provide, so we found that for some of the items we purchase, we can now get data on the CO2 emissions relating to the production, water usage, etc.
Okay.
Is there? I mean, at the moment, I think we need to take this data at face value. But is there any way that we can sort of dig into the organization a little bit and get confidence in the validity of the data that they're providing?
It's a great question. And in honesty, that will come down to the relationship you have with them.
Okay.
So realistically, so as I said, within the carbon information, so as we said before, and this is why I put value on the importance of reporting the data yourself anyway. And as part of that reporting, actually putting in for example, if I say, well, how did you calculate carbon? Are you happy to send me your methodology and the transparency piece of the principles? Can I look at that and actually see how you got to this data, so that I'm satisfied that actually what you've sent across is appropriate? You could also potentially work with them and say, well, do you have any sort of validation? What kind of validation do you have? For example, are they certified? So do you have a certification? Of part of that certification, is there a validity piece around your carbon emissions? So obviously that's something we offer as investors in the environment. So the carbon data that comes to us, we essentially validate that against the emissions, the resource data that you provided to us. So if someone were to say to you, okay, well, how did you get your carbon footprint? You can say, well, look, this is what I'm certified through. This is the process I had to go through. And they, through their external auditing process, they've essentially validated the data. So what I'm giving you is accurate in terms of what we've measured and how we've calculated the carbon footprint. And here's the methodology I followed. So it is just a question of asking them, what are they doing? What have they done? Do they have a certification? Is there anything they could do to potentially validate? And if not, what information can they provide to you to be able to satisfy your need for that quantification and qualification of what the data says?
Okay, so first step, what I take away is look to see how they have been independently certified, and that would be the first step.
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, I mean, with some of the organizations, we see a sort of an increase in certification. So that's definitely something that a lot of businesses are looking at now. But yeah, they may do their own reporting. They may have needs to report. So just ask them the questions. This is why I say it comes down to the relationship you have with them. Ask the questions in terms of what it is that they're doing to validate and justify their carbon emissions, and also what are they doing to improve their carbon emissions? What does their action plan look like? What are their next steps in terms of them helping to improve that? Because whilst we need the data for our scope 3, we may also want to think, well, long-term with the supplier, am I going to have a long-term relationship with the supplier? And if so, I need to understand, what are you doing around your carbon emissions to actually then inform me of whether I want to have a long-term relationship with you as well.
Okay, that all makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Any other thing? You mentioned a couple of things. Was that it?
That was it for
Okay.
on that point. Yes, I may have some questions once I've worked out how to frame them properly.
Okay, no, that's fine, no problem at all. Any questions from anyone else?
No other questions in
No.
the
Okay.
chat right now.
So I do appreciate that this is really heavy and there's a lot involved in this and there's a lot of context to this. And as I said before, the guidance and the protocol from where we're taking the information from is generally focused at complex supply chains, large supply chains and larger organizations. But there are certain elements that even as SMEs, we can take out of this. We may not necessarily need to go to the 55th degree that some of the sort of more complicated chains go to, but there certainly is opportunity for us, even as SMEs. Sorry, my screen's telling me it wants to turn off. There may be opportunity for us, even as SMEs, to take some of the principles and some of the guidance that comes from this and just apply it to us ourselves. So particularly for us as SMEs, the main thing that we want to really take away from this is that value mapping, that value chain mapping exercise is definitely one that I would suggest doing, because it just allows you to actually put down on paper exactly what your operational is, what your operational boundaries look like, who is it you're actually working with, what are the type of things that you're buying in. And so it's a great piece to actually just put it on paper so you can then look at it and go, okay, now what do we do? We then use that weighting. So where's our impact? Where's our influence? What is it that we want to do? Because as part of my environmental policy, I may have a commitment to do something. And actually that commitment informs me that I need to include these aspects of my scope 3, because that actually fits in line with what we are committed to do as an organization. So what are your drivers? What are your objectives? What are the business goals that you want to achieve? And using all of that information to really map out your core big hotspots. And that's really what we want to identify in the first instance. What are my hotspots? What is it I need to do to address those hotspots and bring them down? And then what are the action plans that we sort of cover within that? So the last part of the today's is all around the strategy that sits around this. Now, this sits essentially pretty much the strategy that we have within IAE and within what you're doing as well. So particularly when we get to net zero and we start to look at what net zero means to us, we need to start to think about what is our decarbonization strategy and what does that look like? So this is an hierarchy taken off the IEEMA GHG Management hierarchy, and it's a sort of process that helps organizations work towards net zero. So this is all based upon that. But actually, when we look at it, it's pretty much the same process that we do as part of what you do within IAE as well. So initially, what we want to look at is eliminate. So we want to prevent greenhouse gas emissions across the life cycle through business development, altered operation, new products or services. So what is it that we can do within our business? And can we change any of our activities or services that we can actually eliminate carbon, simply changing what we do as an organization? Where that's not possible, the next boundary is then obviously looking at reducing. So what can we do to reduce it? So what are our efficiencies? What are the reductions we can make? What are the different things that we can do? What kind of technologies do we need to bring in, etc.? And that kind of falls loosely into substitute. So reduce and substitute are kind of two sides of the same coin. But what we want to do is we want reductions in both real and relative terms. What we mean by that is absolute as real, so absolute reductions is really what we're aiming to do. But if we're a growing organization, we can't always reduce absolutely, so we have to think about what the relative reductions are. So are we being more efficient even though we're growing as an organization? Substitution is then feeds off the back of reduction. So can we adopt renewables or low carbon technologies? Where are we purchasing? Are we all on green tariffs? Are we purchasing energy from green tariffs? Where are we purchasing? What kind of services and inputs are we purchasing? And do they have lower carbon aspects, or can we change and replace one product for another that has a lower carbon as such, which all works towards this reduction piece in terms of our carbon emissions? And then finally, the last dot on the I is compensate. So this is through removals and offsets. So removing carbon emissions to be net zero, but also through offsets to actually work towards that climate mitigation. But also this could fit, the compensate fits quite nicely within SDG objectives. So it doesn't always have to necessarily focus on carbon. It could just be improved land management. It could be improved biodiversity, which inadvertently actually has a knock-on effect or a lovely consequence. By doing that, we do also have good climate mitigation objectives as well within that. So as part of the strategy, what we want to do is we want to think about our long-term objectives. So through all of this, we're always thinking about what is it our long-term objectives, what are the business goals, what is it that we want to achieve, and what are the drivers behind that. So as I said before, sometimes, you know, environmental policy, our environmental strategy, whatever it is that we want to look at, what are our objectives that we want to do? You know, if we're looking specifically at net zero, then we want to think about, okay, well, what is it that we need to do as an organization to decarbonize? And what does decarbonization actually mean to us as an organization? So, yeah, what do you need to change as a business to meet net zero and decarbonize your operations? Now, I tend to refer to it as a roadmap for those I've spoken to about this. So, you know, action plans and targetings are your annual activities. These are the things that we're doing day in day, but we need to think about our roadmap. So what does day 1 to day 50, you know, day X look like? And if we are going to decarbonize, what is it we need to do as an organization to decarbonize? What do we need to change? And then what point are we going to make those changes? So we break our roadmap into 3 core functions or 3 core sections. We have the short term, the immediate actions. These are things that we can do straight away. These might already be within our action plan development, or might be things that we're going to be doing. So we're talking within the next 5 years. These could be, these should be predicated against technology that exists, you know, information. They should be really just the sort of the brunt and taking those heavy hits around actually decarbonizing. Now, this can be applied to both scope 1 and 2, which is really fundamental. We really should have a good handle of our own emissions, but then also we can apply these same processes to our scope 3. What is it? What is our short-term objectives? What are our medium-term? What are our long-term as well? The next stage, the medium term, so this is maybe 5 to 10 years down our pathway. These could be a little bit more guesswork. We might have an idea of what we want. They should ideally be established against technologies that exist, so we should know within the next 5 to 10 years we are able to change this technology, and they'll have approximate costings, approximate ideas. So this is really sort of that sort of middle ground between what could still come on board and what is coming on board, but at the moment we can't focus on it yet because we need these initial actions to occur before we can get to that point. And then finally, what are our long-term wish lists? If technology, you know, if what they've touted in terms of technology comes on board, what is it that we want to do? Do we want to be hydrogen ready? Is that something we want to look at? Do we want to, you know, think about like renewable, what kind of renewable technologies are going to come into play? So it's really looking at that sort of future aspect in terms of where is it that we need to go and what are our longer term objectives within that. Now, this process will change continuously because by the time you get to year 5, your long-term ones will have moved in. By that point, we should hopefully then have a better understanding in technology. So it might change altogether. You mentioned the question around, you know, as the industry decarbonizes, that will also have changes to carbon emissions and how things will come in place. So technology that looks good today and 5 or 10 years time may still be good, but it might be something slightly different because of the way you know, innovation, you know, alters and adapts all times. It might even be a case that actually the UK grid decarbonizing actually means that moving into electrification in the next 5 or 10 years is actually the best thing to do because the grid is already decarbonized for us and there's less for us to do other than switching from fossil fuels to that kind of system. But what does that need to look like in order for us to do it? So we want to establish our inventory to look at our scope 1 and 2 and 3. We also want to consider where our hotspots are and focus on it. And then we want to develop our action plans, but all of it sort of sat against the long-term objectives of what is that we want to do as an organization. And continually as throughout, as we do as IE members, we're always reviewing, analyzing and readjusting where necessary to ensure that we're continually working to our long-term objectives as well. And then finally, the last point on that is the removal of the residual carbons. Now, that was generally speaking, I would say, is a last point. What we want to do, particularly as SMEs, is just focus on the sort of scope 1 and 2, your emissions, driving them down as best you can. Start to build your scope 3 inventory and databases. Start to look at where you need to improve data and what kind of information you have, and obviously start to engage with your supply chains. And so your short-term actions is probably just based around that. And by 5 years, 5 to 10, hopefully by that point, you'll have more primary data, better established relationships with your supply chain, and actually starting to push down your scope 3 ambitions. And then right at the end, once we're actually at that sort of 10 years longer, hopefully that whole process is now an easier thing to do. We have good understanding of data. We are able to really make those good reductions. And at that point, we then look at that sort of removal of carbon emissions and, you know, and or looking at offsetting, which we could do at any point, but that's that carbon removal. That's the sort of final step in the overall chain. So that's it. Last point in terms of questions and answers.
Right, and no others have come up in the chat. I have a question, Dave. Could you just briefly outline the difference between removals and offsets? Because I think that is an area which is still sometimes a bit cloudy for people.
Okay. So removals is essentially the permanent capture and sequestration of carbon. So basically what we're doing is we're actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere and we're storing it long term. Now that can be done naturally through tree planting or other bio means, restoring peatland, that kind of thing, where actually the natural environment is able to store carbon and store it in the grounds. There are also on the horizon, we have now carbon capture technologies, which are large vents essentially, which pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. They basically crystallize it and it gets stored underground. So this is something that is it works. It's a proven technology. It's just not at scale yet. So that's sort of a future ambition to actually start to get to these carbon capture and storage processes. So that's capture. That's actually removing the carbon from the atmosphere and not releasing it again. So it's gone completely. Offsetting is essentially the avoidance of additional emissions being created. So what we're doing with offsetting is we're investing in a project that changes the efficiency of how something works to reduce the amount of emissions that current piece of process is emitting. So as an example of this, one of the big offsetting projects we see are efficient cooking systems, shall we say communal cooking areas within some third world countries, where at the moment they're basically building big fires, so there's lots of carbon and really bad air, poor air quality, but that's the only way that they have to cook. So they all come together as a communal cooking area, but it's a really dirty system, and there's obviously a lot of carbon being released from that. So these projects are basically going in, they're converting their space into a sort of a high efficiency cooking venues, which is a solar PV and heat capture and all sorts of things to basically make this a really efficient cooking system. And so what that's doing is that's now removing the carbon emissions that were being put in before. So what they do as an offset is they go in and they build this kitchen, they calculate the emissions that were released from the original fire to the emissions that are now essentially released from this new kitchen, and that difference is the offset. So we're now no longer putting that much carbon into the atmosphere. They turn those carbons into they turn the saving into credits, and they sell those credits to an organization. You buy the offset credits, so that offsets your carbon, and that funds them to go off and do this somewhere else. So they essentially use your offsetting to fund their work to improve and reduce carbon emissions elsewhere that otherwise wouldn't have been able to put in, because there just isn't funding in these places. And that's why offsetting, I think, is a good thing to do, but more on climate mitigation than actually claiming it as an offset. Because what we're doing is we're just helping places that would otherwise struggle fund them to make these improvements to improve their air quality and reduce their carbon emissions. So that's the difference between an offset and a removal. A removal actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere. An offset avoids carbon from being produced through an efficiency project.
Brilliant, thank you. One more question has come in. How accurately can we estimate the carbon reduction from planned future action to ensure we will reach net zero?
It's a good question. If you understand the performance of the technology and you understand your performance, then relatively accurately. I mean, there's always an element of estimation with it, but just as an example, so if you have a sort of let's just say you go from a large gas oven, say 80% burner in terms of its efficiency, and that's using, I don't know, 30 kilowatts of gas to basically produce that, you can calculate the energy that's essentially generated through that oven. Now, if you know that by replacing it, you can put in an oven which maybe through its efficiencies only uses 20 kilowatts, then that saving of 10 kilowatts is essentially the saving of energy that you would make. Now, obviously, it will come down to the frequency of use, how it's used, and the actual energy savings will vary. But just as a thought piece in terms of looking at the initial savings, that accuracy in terms of for every hour we run it, we're always going to be that 10 kilowatt more efficient than if we didn't have it in place. So the actual energy consumption will vary based on how you use it, but that's where we're looking at that saving. It's the efficiency improvement by doing it, and it's as accurate as that. It's just comes down to how much data you have in terms of what you're currently doing and how much data you have of what the new technology will be. Solar PV is a good one because relatively speaking, solar PV only performs as well as there is sunlight. So some years when we get lots of sunlight, they perform fantastically. Other years when we have lots of cloud, they don't perform as well. But we do have data sets which give us an average performance of a solar PV system, so we can roughly speaking tell you how much energy you'll get from it, and that will tell you how much energy you'll potentially save year on year by installing a solar PV system. So as accurate as you can get, but always within an element of estimation, because it does come down to how efficiently you use it and various other factors as well.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave.
Okay, I'm not done. That was the last.
Oh,
question.
sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Just very quickly. Just as I said to you before, these are the sources. Now, the information that we've covered today, a lot of this information has come out of the Scope 3 calculation guidance on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So this is where you have the link to the information, and we can get a lot of the tables and stuff that we talked about in terms of the classifications and that kind of thing. There's also a large part of it which has come through the IEMA pathway to net zero. I just wanted to mention that actually we are offering this IEMA approved course as a discount to IE members. It's a 2-day course, and we'll actually delve deeper into the net zero agenda and actually look at how as an organization you could start to build your pathway to net zero as well. So some of the stuff that we've covered, the very pretty slides, I'll say that, have all come from that one. So it'll be a deeper dive into net zero specifically. There will be some elements of Scope 3, but more around actually building a pathway and a strategy to net zero. So we are delivering that. Is now available on the IE website. You can purchase tickets to the course on there now, and there is a discount if you're an IE member. Just say you are a member, and it will give you the discounts accordingly as well. And then just useful links. So the first link here, this is where I said about the spend. So if you want to look at the spend category for emissions, so when we first starting out with Scope 3, we know how much we spend at a particular category. You want to see what, roughly speaking, what that means as emissions. That's the link to the government website that will give you that. Again, if you do have questions on that, please contact me. I'll be happy to take you through that and show you how it works and how to calculate it. There's obviously the net zero standard, which is on the first slide, but I've included it again. And there's also, just as an example questionnaire, so this is one that you can, it's from the WWF. It's an example questionnaire of types of questions you may start to ask suppliers. So for those still sort of starting out or unsure of what type of questions you want to get, or what kind of information you want to get, it's a really simple sort of process to use. And there's lots of information on the WWF website to help SMEs actually start to tackle these sort of problems. And then